Hello, welcome to another Fission Thursday Tech Talk. Today's guest is Danny O'Brien. Hi, Danny. And we're going to be talking about the Filecoin Foundation and Danny's background and probably a bunch of things about open source and decentralization and how we might want to think about working together to make user data private and secure and generally not tied to centralized giants, which is a bunch of different topics. Please do butt in. Otherwise, Danny, if you could sort of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your current role and your background.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me. And I see a few kind of familiar faces in this crowd, so that's kind of nice to bring them up to date with what's been happening. So to start with me, I always like to start with me. My background is I've been around actually in sort of the decentralized web space before it had a name. I was a veteran of Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. I've spent a bunch of my time, I was a journalist, but I spent a bunch of my time at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which I think the world is divided between people who know what that is and like, oh yeah, that's great. And people have never heard of the organization at all in their entire life, and it would be very hard to explain to them what we did. But briefly, EFF is sort of the ACLU for tech issues. If you've ever wondered about net neutrality, if you've ever heard about like the fight against DRM, if you've ever seen a hacker being defended because they did something that was perfectly reasonable, but the courts didn't understand, the EFF is probably involved in those cases. So it's a digital rights organization, and so I have my finger there in a lot of human rights pies, if that's a term I can use. I did activism there. I actually spent a few years at the Committee to Protect Journalists in the 2010s, because often when you're dealing with digital rights stuff, as you know, if you're on the sort of cutting edge, a lot of it is kind of theoretical. You're sort of going, what would happen if encryption was banned? Or like, we're trying to protect this fledgling technology, which has a lot of potential uses, but we kind of have to explain that to lawmakers before it actually happens. In the 2010s, a lot of those issues became really real pressing issues. And that's sort of been the pattern, I think, of the last 10 to 15 years, is that a lot of things that in the early days, people went, wouldn't it be weird if this happened, happened. And in particular, I was involved sort of protecting journalists and bloggers and online writers, in situations like the Arab Spring and the rise of authoritarian governments and not so authoritarian governments building out their surveillance, censorship, and repression systems, using the internet or thwarting the internet's capability to get around those sort of repressive acts. So that was useful context for when I came back to the EFF in 2013. Which was sort of the Ed Snowden period. Like, this was the point where, after doing this work on the front lines, it became a mass mainstream issue. This was the stuff that I guess the transition is from theoretical, where geeks are the only people thinking about these things, to real, but it's only people who are facing these problems that really know about it, to kind of the mass where everybody is like, holy crap, like something terrible is happening, or there is a promising new technology. Anyway, I was there, I ended up as being director of strategy. One of the things that if you're at an organization like this is you kind of have to predict the future to kind of head things off at the pass. Like, you can't be reactive all the time. And as I said, the thing that is crazy theory right now becomes grim reality or exciting reality just a few months later. So a bunch of what I did there was like the long-term strategic planning of what the EFF should do. I recently left EFF and joined the Filecoin Foundation, and there are a few reasons for that. One is that they're all really nice people, and it's always good to work with nice, smart people. The other thing is that I think we're in another one of those moments, those transitional moments. Like I included, have been kind of like bemoaning the centralization of the internet and kind of thinking about how important it is to re-decentralize that. And now we're at the moment where that becomes foreseeable, right? Like that becomes something that is just beginning to shift from the theoretical to the practical. And I know a lot of times it doesn't feel like that. When you're sort of cranking out code and you're going, none of it works. It's like distributed systems are really difficult. But hopefully you've also had that feeling of, oh, wow, this is kind of coming together now. And like we have actual people using it. And that's sort of terrifying in a different kind of axis. So it's very exciting to be actually doing what I did when I went to the Committee to Protect Journalists, but rather than, oh my God, we have to stop all these nightmare dystopias, going in and going, oh my God, we have to support all of these positive steps so that they can flourish and they're not going to be, you know, stopped or ignored.
Amazing start. Yeah. I'm going to redirect in a couple of different things. So one, I always try and de-jargonize. So ACLU, for those who aren't American, is American Civil Liberties Union. But again, very broadly, while the EFF is based in the US, think of it as the like digital rights strategy and protector for the internet in many ways.
Yeah, and just a key thing to throw in there, which is that yeah, I also run into I don't know what the ACLU is either. It's a law firm, right? It's lawyers primarily, right? That's the DNA of it. So EFF fights court cases to set precedent.
Yeah. I'm also going to be noting down the phrase, I had my fingers in a lot of human rights pies. I'm really glad we created that lovely phrase here. Okay, so Filecoin, your day job is now the Filecoin Foundation. And for those of you that know Fission, we are building a lot on top of the interplanetary file system, which is a protocol and digital commons network that is essentially best effort. If you have a Fission account, we'll make sure stuff stays online for you, or you can run a little Raspberry Pi or run a server to keep it online. And Filecoin is really the companion storage blockchain and that interacts with IPFS to have an economic model to store and keep those files online for the long term. Is that about right in me comparing the two, Danny?
Yeah. So technically, that is spot on. The one thing I would say is that I sort of have two hats. So I work for both. I work for the Filecoin Foundation, which is sort of job is to steward that whole ecosystem, and we can talk a little bit about the Filecoin IPFS ecosystem. But I also, at night, I fight crime. No, I also volunteer time to our other wing, which is the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web, which is a broader mandate, essentially, which is, I think, when I'm explaining it to people in the Filecoin ecosystem, it's like, if you're trying to build decentralized tools, it doesn't help if everything else is still centralized, right? Like it reduces your unique selling point because your customers are going to be screwed in some other way by the centralized system. And in Filecoin's case, you can store on the IPFS network, you could store on Filecoin, you can have this beautiful decentralized system. But if everything else is locked into Amazon or Google or Facebook, the advantages aren't. You have some advantages, but like they're they're attenuated. So what I want to do, both as a sort of technical and kind of as a social mission, is to decentralize everything, right? And that means supporting projects, people, and policies in all different kinds of parts of the internet and digital ecosystem. So so that's just my easy job.
Yeah, I mean, decentralize everything as a rallying cry is actually pretty great. But yeah, I mean, you've literally just said everything. That project, people, and policies, I think, is something that's super useful that I haven't heard before, and I think that's a really good way to frame that. Hey, if you merely write some code but don't talk to lawmakers so that the code that you're writing is actually like illegal or not allowed, that's not going to help. So you have to do the policy piece as well, and everything in between. That's really great.
I would say, yeah. I would say there's another sort of aspect to it. So there's sort of compliance, which why you're describing there, but the real problem and the trouble that my experience at EFF really indicates is when you get into a situation where regulations anticipate one model of how the digital world works, and they don't take into account that there are other ones. So just to give some really good examples, right? So a lot of countries, for good reasons and for bad reasons, want to push data localization, which is that they say, you know, if you're dealing with people in our country, you have to keep the data in our country. And on the good side, maybe you could say the GDPR has that sort of model, kind of, because there's an idea that your data is located somewhere in Europe, and if it moves out, there are harder rules. But also Russia does the same thing. And Russia, I think it's fair to say, is specifically doing that so they can impose greater controls and surveillance over their citizens. So how do you match that with a decentralized model where the data is talking about where it is just doesn't make sense, and talking about, like, you know, oh, the data stays within these borders and never goes across them. It's just it's kind of incoherent, right? So a lot of times you're talking with courts, you're talking with lawmakers creating potential laws and going, if you have to think about this differently, and that's not to say you can't regulate, but you're going to break things if you do this.
We're involved in some standards-based work in the Decentralized Identity Foundation, and some of the requirements there. So we were talking about a personal data store, where a user has data, much like how we've set up Fission today. And they said that some of their like enterprise participants wanted to be able to essentially restrict data literally at the P2P layer of IPFS. And we're like, yeah, I mean, technically it's possible, it's programming, but that's not something that we're super interested in putting a bunch of effort into. Right. I think that's interesting. I wanted to pick up on something is the decentralized everything, and just like mentioning that list of things where we listed both cloud providers and then sort of a social network at the end of it, kind of thing. I think one of our working models is that Fission exists and is building a stack of identity and data / storage and compute, in part so that for a developer, you don't have to learn this full stack and have to manage or DevOps a whole set of expertise, and also sort of easy scaling where you're not, you know, if you get popular, you don't immediately face a giant bill, which we believe makes it easier to launch and maintain small apps. And then the other side of user agency, where if there isn't a developer having to maintain a server and promise not to look at their data, right? So there's the different architecture supports higher user agency and so on. And this is in reaction to you can't really compete with the hyperclouds, is the shorthand phrase I use. So Amazon, Google, and Azure as the three big ones. There's, kind of a few more, but even Europe itself, the European Union was like, hey, we're going to pool funds. We're going to build a European cloud. And it turns out even multiple nation states don't have enough money, which means that probably in today's architecture, and that we have to in fact change the architecture if we want to give more choices. Is that, do you think of it in that way, and maybe even bridge to like, how does that also compare? That's the sort of infrastructure piece. And then how does Facebook fit into that picture for you, where you're thinking? And I hope we haven't lost Danny. Bum bum. He was having some trouble with his audio and video and Zoom earlier, so we will see if we can get him back. What's the thing that someone, so actually show of hands or snaps or whatever, who actively uses a Facebook account still? Anyone on this call? No. Nice, Philip.
I never signed up.
Oh, you're so pure, Jury. I will admit that I got early. I was no longer in university, but I got early access because a friend of a friend's niece was in college, and we got in slightly before they let in non-college people at that point. What is the most what is the social network that people on this call use most regularly that can be seen as a mass market one? Mark Antoine says Twitter. Yeah, I'm on Twitter. Another Twitter. Slack. I would be a lot happier with Slack if I could have some sort of sane version where I only had one account. LinkedIn, email. Hello, Danny.
Hello. Hi. We should never have mentioned kernel panics earlier, Boris, because my whole system just went down for a moment, just completely blacked out, like an EMP pulse was coursing through my house. Also, for some reason, my headphones aren't working, but so if I'm getting echo, tell me, but I think it's fine as it is. So let's carry on.
Audio's good, yeah. So I did a show of hands. Literally no one on this call actively uses Facebook anymore. And there were some who said, I never signed up. So that's the kind of crowd that you have. And then in the chat, I just did a show of hands and asking around is that Twitter is the mass market social network that tends to get used the most. So I was kind of bridging, I don't know if you caught the last of my question was sort of like hyperclouds and infrastructure, and how do you compare and contrast to like social network, and one's very architectural and the other one is the mass market. How do you think about that?
To be fair, social networking is probably more representative of the age of the people on this call than anything actually about the social networks themselves.
Yeah,
I think of
filters. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I do try and kind of encourage people, like, there are two parts to this. One is that I really feel that I personally should, as the horrible Microsoft phrase, had it eat our own dog food, right? I'm a big advocate of actually trying out the things that you're advocating for. So you are the person who suffers the kernel crashes rather than the people who might actually need this. and I think that's part of that theoretical to real transition that happens. But on the other hand, I think it's a real, to use a perhaps overused term, privilege to be able to say, oh no, I'm not going to be using Facebook because, you know, a lot of people have to use Facebook, right? Otherwise, they can't afford to run their business. And so I never judge anyone for using these centralized things, except possibly myself. But anyway, yeah, so it's sort of, there's this kind of question about, do you barge into kind of the infrastructure and decentralize the infrastructure and then think that that will permeate to consumers, or citizens, as I prefer to think of people, even if you're not a citizen. If you're stateless, you're still a citizen in my head. Or do you start with the people, and then hopefully they put sort of pressure on these organizations to unwind themselves in different ways, right? And I mean, sadly, usually the answer to all of these things is you have to do both. But I think that the model I have, and it's sort of a strange one, which is a lot of the way we think about this is that we try and pick on the centralized services weaknesses, right? Where we sort of go, oh, they're spy-y, and they're like, they run my life, they make people feel sort of powerless, so we'll empower people. And like, we have this bunch of like good things that we have to offer people, right? But I feel like the transition happens when you successfully attack the incumbent on their strengths. So, and it's important to kind of be able to model like your, I'm sorry to use these terms like opponent, right? But like, you know, it's important to model the thing that you're dealing with, right? The world that as it actually is. And that involves actually kind of understanding why people use Facebook or why people would use Amazon. And that's why, you know, people, as Jim says, they are, you know, people who are different, right? Like, there are many different reasons to do that. And sometimes your own, well, I would leave Facebook because I know it's super invasive and I don't trust Mark Zuckerberg. Well, you're already you're already there. Like, how do we, what's happening here? And the two things I would pick out as the strengths of the centralized system, and when we watched people move into that, the reason why, one of them was security, right? Like, it was, it's really hard to maintain your own infrastructure. Like, no one should do it. And it's safer in what Bruce Schneier, the cryptographer, calls these sort of feudal security cities, right? Where you, the feudal data overlord goes, come into my castle and I will protect you from the bad stuff outside, right? And it's a perfectly reasonable security model, right? Perimeter security, right? Like, when I was at CPJ, people would go, oh, what system should I use? What email system should I use to protect myself from malware and surveillance of nation states? And, you know, with my EFF hat on, I'm sure I would have been going, oh, you should use PGP and you should, you know, run your own mail server or whatever. But pretty soon you realize, because you're dealing with the real world, you go, use Gmail. Because Gmail has, like, Gmail's threat model is very similar to yours, and they have a lot of money to defend themselves against that. You know,
and CPJ acronym,
Committee to Protect Journalists. Yeah. So
thank you.
So we have to tackle that, right? We have to have a good security story. And I mean, I hasten to, you know, we do, right? Because one of the other thing about these strengths, if you attack something on its strengths or you criticize it on its strengths, you realize pretty soon that there are limits to those strengths. And of course, the one in the centralized world is every 30 minutes, someone does successfully hack into these huge honeypot targets, and like steals all the details that you were trying to protect, right? So this just happened to me in T-Mobile, right? Like my SSN is a social security number in the US is now on some dark web website. So that security model doesn't work. The guarantees it makes are failing. What alternative do we have?
So I think there's some really interesting stuff going on that's super current. So one, Fission's approach is, and our model in thinking about an infrastructure that works differently has been essentially, let's assume all of the pipes are broken.
Right.
And thus we encrypt all user data. Let's also assume that it is very hard to keep user data in a spot, and that it's becoming toxic, that by not storing it either in the developer or the service provider, you can't leak things that you don't have access to, basically, right? So our service provider model is non-custodial. Users have keys, we can't see them. And the identity model and authentication model is non-custodial for developers as well, where they only get access to the parts that they're granted to. So I think that's an example as well, where any app that someone builds today in a classic style, shall we say, is going to be a database. It's extremely difficult to encrypt data in a database. And there's always the the developer can, or other people at an organization can go peek in there whenever they want.
So that's exactly it, right? Like, I think that these sort of models, these kind of trustless models, right, where you're going, everything is, the only thing I can really build is this system, right? To trust myself, or limited trust, is a model which is resilient to all kinds of different attacks, right? Because it's actually trying to solve the problem at the base of it, rather than just moving the problem around. So, and it's funny watching the progress of this elsewhere, right? Where I feel like there are lots of attempts to solve this problem in a centralized way that don't quite work. So you end up with a slow move to the same solution. So one of the ones the transition that I find really interesting in the centralized security model is, so originally it was very literally this idea of perimeter security, right? Like, we build a firewall and you will be safe in here. And then they're sort of moving, I was reading the Google blog post about them in cooperation with the US government, putting $1 billion ostensibly into cybersecurity. And one of the things that they talked about was this zero trust model, right? Which is the sort of centralized version of what we're talking about. Like, in this decentralized world, we assume this, right? And we build these things as resiliently as we can, because if we don't, then everybody can break it down, right? There's no privileged person, everybody gets an opportunity to have a hand. In the centralized world, they're going, okay, we should move to that model, but we'll call it zero trust. And I went, oh, this sounds like what I know people in the decentralized space build all the time, right? And so I was a little bit worried, right? Because one of my things is that I don't want Facebook and Google to have the good ideas and keep them, right? My motto is they stole our revolution, now we're stealing it back, right? Like, if they have good ideas, let's steal them back and use them. So I looked into it, and zero trust actually is like one trust, right? Because you just basically have to trust Google, because they're building a zero trust system, but they control all of it, which is very like Apple right now, where Apple is like, we're building this amazing thing for client scanning on your device, and don't worry, because we can't see various parts of it. We've built amazing crypto magic, so we can't see it. And you're sitting there going, you control my device. You write the software, you post the software to it. The only indication I have of the software you're using on it is a little UI thing that says, oh, in this update, we put this in. And I have no visibility into it. No one else can see it. It's a fake. You cannot give someone in power
Yeah.
all of that power, and then rely on them going, don't worry, you can trust me. You literally have to.
We've been
Anyway,
very. I think there's some really interesting phrases in there. They stole our revolution. We should steal it back. So Apple, we've been very conflicted about, from the perspective of, we are also doing an extreme edge computing, user controlled encryption model, which is essentially like Apple. And in some ways, we think about like building a similar stack, but instead of being trapped in the Apple ecosystem, something that can be used anywhere, right? Those are the pieces that we are also aiming for, with the same level of usability. And in fact, there's a really interesting thing where social recovery of private keys has been talked about for a long time. And I kind of pushed it aside because I'm like, I don't think that we can deploy this because we are too small to be able to educate a large number of people. But with Apple actually now releasing some social recovery, I'm like, great, they're doing the hard work of educating people that this is something that you can quote unquote trust. And then we can attack the Apple piece there and saying, yeah, we can also do social recovery securely and non-custodially and so on.
Absolutely. And again, this is the thing of, I don't want to miss ideas just because Google, Facebook, or Amazon licked them first, right? Like a cookie. And they go, oh, this is a good idea, we're going to do it. And then, there is a tendency in our community to go, oh my God, that's like Google did that, therefore we shouldn't do it. But also, I mean, I shouldn't overstate that, right? Like the environment that you are in right now is not just determined by these big companies, and these big companies do respond to shifting incentives, right? So my time at EFF, there were two things that we really spent a lot of time trying to establish, right? One was encrypting the web, right? One was shifting the whole of the web from HTTP, which costs intelligence authorities, cyber criminals, and commercial companies pennies to survey, right? Because it's all plain text. You can just see it going through the background. So we had to raise the economic cost of that surveillance to turn it from being mass surveillance, which is just universally a bad idea, to targeted surveillance, which is, what law enforcement did, and is probably where the social consensus lies, right? I think that people are like okay with somebody spying on the bad guys. So that meant encrypting the web, which we did with Let's Encrypt, which is, a free service so that you can encrypt your website very quickly and easily and super cheaply, like for no money at all, as opposed to the difficulty.
I know that there are lots of working developers today who do not understand the pain and carnage of a Let's Encrypt time of buying certificates and setting them up correctly.
Yeah. So we managed to get the web from under 10% encrypted to, I think it's like over 90 now, right? By simply going, okay, we'll just make this easy for everyone, right? And the other side of it, like the other example of this, is two-factor authentication, right? So we were going, okay, this stuff is fundamentally insecure. We need to get the companies to do this.
Ask me about Canadian banks and 2FA still today.
So the tragedy with TFA is that I think people get it now, right? Like I think that's talking about this consumer,
yes,
corporate kind of division. Like I'm always checking to see what people have in their heads as their sort of folk model of how the internet works. And like I think people get that TFA is like a thing that makes things secure. The sad thing is that companies don't push it. Very small, shockingly small percentage of people use TFA. And secondly, a lot of it is like sending a text message, via SMS, which is like not actually much more. I mean, small steps, right? Anyway, the point of this is that if you create a user flow, and like I will say, I'm not just, you know, sucking up to you all. Like one of the reasons I was excited to give this talk is that, and I told Boris here as I was playing around with phishing codes, and I went, ooh, this is like magic distributed identity. Like I can kind of, it's like, you know, the prestige of a magic trick. Like I can kind of see where the key goes. And I can recognize that this is a private key kind of operation, but you're doing it so smoothly that I don't spot, like, you know, I don't have to save my 24 words or whatever. So, and once you get people into that, right, like once you have that existence proof, the truth is that like, for all the work we did on Let's Encrypt and like pressuring companies to turn on HTTPS, the key one was Google turning on HTTPS, because everybody went, well, if Google does it, then we should be able to do it. And that's always a challenge in a decentralized space, right? Because you're deliberately not, you're doing things that Google doesn't necessarily want or you to do. So you have to propagate by word of mouth. And the tactical question is whether you propagate by word of mouth through the corporate space, which is, you know, how I think we did with HTTPS, right? Is that we gradually got big companies to do this and other people went down, or kind of like TFA or strong passwords, right? Spreading the word about what strong passwords are, where you kind of do that the other way. You kind of do that from technical experts talking to other people and permeating that way.
I think of that as the kids going home at American Thanksgiving and installing Firefox on their parents' computers.
Absolutely.
Model,
right.
So hygiene propagating through people who are more technical.
Absolutely. And you can't win everybody over with that. Like there's but you get that small core that is the existence proof that you can prove to other people. So, I mean, just to get, Firefox is a great example. And it's also an example of doing something where users recognize that when their interests vary from the centralized services that they're in hock to, right? And so Firefox took off because at a time when Internet Explorer was not blocking pop-up ads, that was the thing that drove it, right? And people were like, I hate these ads, and like no one is helping me fix them. And then Firefox came in and said, we don't care, like we'll block anything, right? Like we'll you know, that's what we do. Huge uptake. Google itself is testimony to this, right? You know, for those of you who were around, like Google didn't advertise, right? Google didn't like force Google in multi-billion-dollar deals with Apple to just have it by default. At the beginning, they were just better, right? Like people just went, oh yeah, this Alta Vista sucks, this is good. And those propagatory models still work. The fact that you have a lot of companies that sort of hyper accentuate them through, you know, enforced virality and attention doesn't mean you can't steal that and use it yourself, right?
Yeah. So I think there's, thank you for the kind words. I would say that from a more mass market audience, one of our issues is that I didn't have to put a password into Fission. Is it secure? Right? Where I'm like, oh my God, I'm in a mirror world where I actually have to do the other part where people are like, I don't have a mental model for this working, therefore it's probably not secure, right? So we may need to do some sort of like fancy like lock animation that's like encrypting your data with your device or something. I have no idea.
So again, some historical examples very quickly, and then let's have some questions, right? So we struggled with this with open source, right? We struggled with this with a lot of things where people's intuition about trustworthy software is entirely in variance to what Geeks model of trustworthy software is. And I think the Geeks model is like more accurate, right? Where I'm sitting there going, trying to persuade people who are using, I don't know, Facebook Messenger, which is unencrypted, to use Signal. And they're like going, why would I use Signal? Like, it's Facebook. It's going to be more secure. Like, why would this be more secure? Like, this website looks shitty. It's a small company and it's free, right? Like, it, you know, there's like, it's free software. You just said it was free software. Like, obviously, free small things are crappy compared to nice, big, well-funded things. And also this appears to be run by a hippie, right? And so you have to work out like how to reorient people so that they have the right instincts about these things. So that's a cultural shift as well. And again, we've done it before, we could do it, we can do it again. It's funny, I'm talking very high level strategy here. So I'm totally happy to kind of delve into the crunchy details of the Filecoin Foundation and all of this.
Let's definitely get there. Jeff, you had a point that you wanted to make.
I was just gonna point out that Fission's please type these numbers from this one website into this other website that are both on the same URL security model. We're also leveraging new login user flows that happen with Apple, and so that's another way where we take the user experiences that happen on some of these majors, and we're leveraging that. I say to Boris all the time, you know, we can thank the pandemic for getting people used to scanning QR codes, which is going to be a really big deal in UX flows for years, and we can thank Apple for having that, you know, number code copy scheme and exposing millions and millions of consumers to it, and not just consumers, but consumers who can afford iPhones, and so are probably more engaged in technology, or at least you know, so that and what happens there is that Apple does lead user experience for the rest of the industry, because the rest of the industry doesn't spend as much money on it. They just sort of copy what Apple does, and that those are kinds of things where these major companies do things, and if they align with what we're doing, we should pounce on them and leverage them as much as we possibly can. Because then we'll seem less strange and bizarre, and people won't have to copy down 24 words or whatever. So
ride the new propagatory model, right?
Yeah,
is essentially what it is we can draft off that mass market messaging and say,
yeah,
like that.
And yeah, and it's just like, you know, where does, you know, an Apple or an AWS or a Google have alignment with what our principles are? Google is forcing everybody to go SSL in order to have good search results. So there's an economic incentive for a bunch of people. And that's because Google cares about people feeling safe about spending money on the web. Otherwise, none of this gets paid for. And so as much as we can align with that and benefit from that as the tiny, scrappy, hippie, you know, lunatic fringe over on one side, we should, because there's far more resources going into it with these big companies in those specific things.
Hey, I shaved yesterday. I still do need a haircut, but that's a separate thing. Yeah, I think one of the models, just to stick on the propagatory, and then I do want to dive into some of the Filecoin stuff and lay that out. So one of our working models, other than identity, is that with Fission, the promise is that any app that you interact with, you have access to your data, not as a separate like export step. So much like what we're used to on mobile or desktop, you can always get access to your stuff, and that there's a loop there where the user understands that, oh, amazing! If I have a Fission-powered version of a to-do app, then I can use the same images that I have in my photo gallery. And this is not very radical, because that is literally how mobile works today, but it is not how web apps work today. So that's a model where we're moving storage back to the user as well. Yeah, so and again, that storage piece is exactly how we get to Filecoin. We selected IPFS as a major building block because what we are excited by is content addressing of to give us and users and developers data portability. We may save the bits, but your browser saves the bits and you can save them offline, and it's self-verifying. We don't have to worry about where, that it is the same data as well. And again, in these times, even just knowing that this is the same image that was passed along is super useful. So the Filecoin piece is we today have a classic system, but built out of decentralized components where we said, hey, we're going to stand up and we're going to make a bunch of this stuff work. And we're also going to say, hey, we're going to make sure that your data stays around, and likely a model where people can pay us in regular dollars. But we're very interested in participating in non-hypercloud models where, in fact, we are part of a network. So we run nodes, servers that provide economic surety, and have an economic flow to offer and request storage or compute or other things like that, which brings us to Filecoin. So the Filecoin Foundation was formed as part of launching this global storage-based blockchain. Yes? What's the order of operations?
So the flip side of this is like, yeah, steal ideas for centralized people because they have the marketing budget, and also, Apple or whatever, invest a lot of money in user interface and can propagate that out. But the other thing is that like our whole stack, all the technologies we use are increasingly bent around this idea of centralized tools. Like the example I always use here is Kubernetes, right? So Kubernetes is something where like it's this beautiful, like well-funded, thoughtful kind of open source project that is designed to solve problems that Google has. And so you end up kind of like feeding off Google's scraps, and it sort of bends you into those central models. There are alternatives, right? But they're under-resourced. And there's like research you can do, and there's building the tooling that you can do. But but you have to think about what is useful for the decentralized world. So some of the really powerful ideas that have come out of the crypto boom, and also just the general research that came out of the early internet, where we were all thinking in decentralized terms. One of the ones that I think is the most powerful in the last few years, that has had a lot of capital invested in it because of the cryptocurrency boom, is this idea of incentive crypto economic systems, right? Things where you have like a mass of different agents, like different stakeholders, if you will, but you've built the system so all of their incentives are aligned to keep the ecosystem going and also generate public goods as like a side effect. And that's not something that any centralized service cares about, right? When people go, why are you using the blockchain for this? When, IBM or Amazon or whatever comes in and goes, we're going to use the blockchain. It's because the blockchain is specifically designed for a decentralized system. It doesn't make any sense. They could just have a database, right? What's the point? So the Filecoin Foundation's job is to kind of keep poking this ecosystem as it grows, and making sure that like as it grows in this autonomous way, like there isn't like a failure mode that wasn't anticipated. My usual joke amongst geeks is the Filecoin Foundation is kind of like Isaac Asimov's foundation, and I'm hoping that will become more comprehensible now that there's a Apple series about Isaac Asimov's foundation. But so that's kind of our role in the system. I think just to kind of put a precise pin on this, right? Like the design of the Filecoin ecosystem, and I encourage everybody to read the white paper because it actually makes sense, and it's not just, you know, someone writing something in LaTeX, is to create an incentive system for a commons-like project like IPFS that keeps and maintains that commons. And Eleanor Ostrom style, if you want me to name drop, right? Like, so you know, the people who built this did the reading. And one of the side effects of that is that it is remarkably cheap for people who want to store the kind of stuff we want to store on IPFS to use that network. So I think that's great for like something like Fission, right? Because suddenly people are going, why, you know, why am I like paying pennies for the storage compared to Amazon? And it's great for building out this stack for a decentralized future, right? Because we can compete again on services like Amazon on price. Price and alignment of goals, right? Ultimately, the thing that breaks the centralized model, whether we're talking about government or we're talking about technology or we're talking about like, you know, your local town, is when the people that you've given that power to, because you don't want to spend all your time running a mail server or, you know, like deciding what things should be taught in your local school. Their incentives and their intentions wander off the ones that you have, right? And with decentralized systems, you work really hard to keep those two things the same thing, right? And it doesn't have to be that I am literally, you know, growing my own crops or running my own node, but there are systems that constantly move back whoever I deputize that knowledge to, whether it's Fission or someone else, back into alignment with the end user, and that's ultimately kind of the advantage that we have, is that people, if we can keep that going, right, then people feel more empowered and ultimately can do the things that they want to do, rather than this weird situation where people have this incredibly empowering technology in their hands and they feel powerless.
Yeah.
Right. It's just so bizarre. It boggles the mind. And I look forward to having everybody kind of snap out of it and go, wait, I can do whatever I want with this.
Amazing. Okay. So I want to, one of the things that you're doing is you're going around and saying, hey, organization X, you're storing petabytes of climate data and it's costing you real money. Can we at the Filecoin Foundation help you so you can use that money for other things? Because really, storage should be orders of magnitude cheaper than it is today. It should be more decentralized. And once we can think about reliable global storage being much cheaper and more available, we can start doing different storage compute trade-offs, which gets us to other interesting things. So this, like, going around, and I think you said this to me when we were at a prep call, you want to essentially like say, I want to give you your Filecoin data grants so that you as an organization can put large data on. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so FFTW is a nonprofit. Filecoin Foundation, you know, we have a sizable amount of the pre-mine, so we can invest in these things. I see it less as kind of like an incentive to get people on Filecoin, because I think in some ways, like, the risk in the cryptocurrency world is you create these sort of fake markets where you go, here, like, have a lot of money to like use our software, and people go, okay, I'll take the money and I'll pretend to type things on your software, and it's sort of a Potemkin kind of environment, right? It's a Potemkin, like, weird jargon, but like it's a fake town that like you build to like make it look like good things are happening. So our model is much more about like, how do we invest in things that people need, but kind of fall between the stools, right? So we're not going to build a fission. We're not going to, pay people to use fission. But if there's tooling that fission needs, and sort of going, why are we doing this, right? Like, we're building something that everybody needs. We can come in and go, okay, like, we can do that. And the big player in this space is Protocol Labs, because Protocol Labs built IPFS. They came up with the Filecoin protocols. They wrote the first version of the client. They had the ICO that funded a lot of this stuff, right? But we are very separate from what they're doing, because they are one of multiple stakeholders now in this big ecosystem, and their intentions are not necessarily aligned with everybody else either, right? Like, I mean, they all mesh, but you need to like poke it sometimes just to get it going in the right direction. So yeah, I mean, we do fund hackathons, we do have dev grants, we do all of those things as well. But like, I am also looking at supporting things that are a little bit less obvious, right? Like things like, we talked a lot, you and I, Boris, about decentralized identity, right? And decentralized identity gives a lot of benefits to systems like Filecoin, and you can kind of see how they would be part of that system, right? Like, there's a sort of reputation thing that you want to build on top of Filecoin, which would be useful. So it's a part of the puzzle, but you wouldn't start there, right? You would start somewhere else, and then that would be a benefit. So working out what that would look like
to do encryption. So we didn't necessarily like aim at identity first either, but we realized that it was a precursor to being able to do encryption. So we're like, okay, if we want to do encryption, we need to do identity, and that sort of led us down the path of, okay, if we want to do an encrypted personal data store and encryption isn't built into IPFS, then we need to add that, and connecting it to identities makes the most sense, right?
Yeah. And also working with other groups. So some of you may know that Blue Sky is the Twitter decentralized model, and it's very tempting in this environment to go, they won't know how to do that, like we know how to do that. And in fact, like, what I want to do is like, and have been, is talking to all of these different groups and going, okay, what do you want to do? Like, and like the smart people are like, I can't boil the ocean, right? I think that was people's presumption about Blue Sky, is that they were going to come elbowing in. And one of the reasons it went very slowly is they kind of quickly realized that there were a lot of other people in this space who maybe had gone through and learned some lessons here. And so they pulled back a bit. Talking to all of these different participants and going, okay, what bit of this can you do? The nice thing with Filecoin and IPFS is we have a pretty clearly defined thing of what we want to do, which is store the world's data, like be this kind of storage layer of the stack. And, there are some alternatives to that, right? But it doesn't really matter. Like, we all benefit from having all of these things. So I have another meeting in now, but I just emailed them and said, this is going really well. Like, let's do the question Q&A, but I will have to like jump out and in 10 minutes. But
that's a lovely ending, and I think I think even just saying that there are other alternatives, if they are also market-based and network-based, we can bridge between them in different ways, because it is ultimately the same model. And then you've got coupled incentive systems that should figure themselves out, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yes. Questions. Been a few chats of things. Any specific things about Filecoin, the foundation, IPFS, Danny saving the world through journalism and encryption?
Or helping other people save the world was like I dodged the big responsibility.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jerry.
Sorry, I'm indirectly, but hello. I just want to ask one question. I've been thinking about it for a long time. It's not decentralized we need. We really need a people-centered internet, you know, like Windsurf got a Twitter account and a foundation or non-profit. That's what we need. We need to have technology which addresses that problem, and the IPFS ecosystem and everything has everything you need to build one. I mean, I basically got the design of a decentralized Twitter, which is not Twitter because it's not decentralized, it's people-centered. As soon as you make the system people-centered, it's viral and it works. And of course, it won't be global. That's the whole point. It will eventually, like the whole internet. So I really want your opinion. Why do we talk about decentralized when it's people-centered we need?
Yeah, I think that's a really, I think that's a good question. And I think like both terminologies have some problems, right? Like I'm always like sitting there going, oh God, why do people call it the decentralized web? Because like, first of all, like nobody knows what decentralized is in a wider thing. And it's not the web. It like annoys people who are, you know, pedantic about the terminology, and it annoys people who like, you know, just want a fluffy term to describe it. So the challenge with people-centered is I try and steer away from things that just sound positive, but can be captured, right? So if I was to say, let's build a people-centered web, and it was successful, you can guarantee that Apple or Amazon would be in their next marketing cycle would be welcome to the people-centered internet, right?
Yeah, okay.
So you have
interpersonal computing then.
Right. So personal computing is a really good one, actually, and that yeah. So and like honestly, I sort of feel like let's try every single term and just throw our weight behind the one that works. In many ways, the decentralized web that's why we picked that term, is that you know, not Windsurf, but the other guy, Tim Berners-Lee, was using that term a lot, and it was like picking up some traction. And so we went, if this is what people are using to describe this, you know, you can argue about terminology quite a lot. And like the funny thing for me is like we use Google, Twitter, and Yahoo. Like those are all really strange things to like have as names for like serious things. So you just go with what works.
Yeah, I meant it as an architecture, not as a descriptive term.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think it is. I think it's the same thing, right? I think it's I mean, I use these stupid terms of like alignment of incentives, right? And autonomy. But what it ultimately comes down to is a fairly aggressive position, which is that devices and technology are so intimate that the only people who should really be able to control them are the people that you know they're attached to. And like we don't do that with a lot of things, actually. Like you know, cars are very intimate things, but they have quite a big layer of control put on them by the state and by government because they're dangerous, right? People will argue that technology is dangerous, and I agree, right? But I feel like the real issue here is that our devices and our digital lives and our technology and stuff like that are so intimate. They're more like extensions of our mind, right? Extensions of our actual consciousness. So, God, that does sound hippie. But what I mean there is like, when somebody says we'll just put this spying thing in your phone because we're worried that you know you might get the wrong images or stuff, that's like putting something in your head. And like we have to like maintain this inalienable autonomy to, as you say, the people-centered technology that we're building.
So this is great. We have struggled with the short form label. I think decentralized web and dweb, like, let's call it, we're going to use that term going forward as an umbrella bucket that people can play within. One, two, the other thing, like exactly what you said, we have found a lot of alignment, and there's a number of people on this call who play in this space as well, including Jury, is the tools for thought space. A number of those people, both builders and the people using it, are saying, this is very intimate stuff. I don't want it on someone else's server. I want to be able to see it, right? And so we're starting to see this crossover where those people are looking for architectures that solve for that, and realizing, oh, there's a rabbit hole here, but if I want encryption, I need identity, etc.
Yeah. And if you don't have that, whether you know about all of this technical stuff or not, you feel sick. Right? Like all of this sort of angst about technology right now comes from people who've lost that without even knowing that it was there, and are like going, I hate that I'm enthralled to this phone, and like I don't feel like I'm in control. And going, well, there's a reason for that, and there's an alternative to that.
Other questions, prompts for Danny? We're just going to go on rants on whatever people say. So like,
we're preaching to the converted here, so like, but it's good to practice these things, right?
It's very good texture. I'll give an example, and these are constant cycle. Robert has a question. Was Web 2.0 self-aware in the same way Web 3 seems to be?
No. So it's really interesting talking to Web 3, people who see Web 2.0 as kind of ancient history. So I work with a guy, Jonathan Dotan, and he actually worked on HBO's Silicon Valley as a consultant. So if you've ever wondered why that was all about decentralized internet, you blame Jonathan. He now works on the Starling project at Stanford, which we fund, which is taking the testimony of Holocaust and other genocide survivors and making sure that that will never be literally forgotten, right? Never be erased. So it's a really important project. But he was saying he was going through some of the old discussions about Web 2.0 that, you know, some of us were around for, and just going, it's kind of hilarious how like the things that I mean, he said they missed, but I felt like, oh shit, this is my fault. And yeah, I think you learn, right? Like the one thing I feel that we should have done in Web 2.0 that we actually did in Web 1.0 is build institutions. So some of the other things that the FFDW, the Filecoin Foundation, the Decentralized Web support, is things like the Internet Archive, EFF, and other things that are still around from the Web 1.0 days and still have a function now. And the mistake that I think we made, because we were kind of drowning in alternative organizational models, is we thought, oh, you know, these will just run on their own, right? There'll always be bloggers. There'll always be open source developers. So we'll just have at it. We'll have the hive mind do this.
I think that's a really, really good point. And I think very specifically what happened is we thought we were building software, but we were building communities, which we did realize, but we then didn't go to the next step of that. There needed to be organizational bandwidth somewhere, sort of at scale. I am very heartened by things like very specific toolkits. I think of Open Collective as the let's encrypt of collective formation, with the very basic thing of like, I don't want to set up an organization in order to have a bank account to file local taxes and all that other nonsense. I could just use Open Collective. And in fact, the way that they've done it, an Open Collective can fund other Open Collectives. So we got like some of those models right this time around. There's lots more to this, and that's not the same institutional level as an EFF.
Yeah, it's like that phrase, you know, the shoemaker's children go shoeless, right? So it was a whole period of creating incredibly new ways to organize. as you said, like there wasn't the self-insight to know maybe we should use this to build some things to protect this movement. I mean, there are counterexamples, like Wikipedia is one of them. OpenStreetMap is you know, it's not a barren wasteland, but I think we have to do this more consciously, and this is one of the things that we're trying to do at the foundation. And in fact, the foundation is an example of, right?
Right. Robert, does that answer your question? By self-aware, I also meant aware of itself emerging. Is the label Web3 bigger than dweb? I think there's a lot of carnage between the label Web3 and dweb and all of these other things that I have so much trouble with this, because like when I'm editing copy that people are writing, like I tell them not to use dweb because that's one community and Web3 is another community. I'm like, just say decentralized web, and then nobody feels that they own it, right? So I'm going to go on record to attempt to explain it, and everybody else can tell me whether I'm getting it right or not. I believe that dweb comes more from the P2P network stack, open source, decentralized identity folks who have a direct line to open source who kind of never went away. And that Web3 is a superset of dweb that includes that, but very specifically includes blockchains and cryptocurrencies.
I mean, that is the correct explanation. The challenge is, and one of the things that I'm trying to work to fix, is that community, traditional open source community, who's been building amazing tools from Mastodon to secure Scuttlebutt, is very alienated from the crypto blockchain community right now. And so they're not stealing one another's ideas, right? Like they're not like, that's a very good example of going, well, like I'm not going to do that because they're doing that, or I don't know of those people, so it's not invented here. And I want to like cross-fertilize, if not the people, then the ideas between those two things. I should go and talk
Thank
to
you
this
so
other
much.
meeting. But thank you so much. And like, I'm on your Discord, right? So it's Discord. I don't know what I am there. I'm Danny O'Brien. And like, join us on the Slack. I will email me at danny@depil.org. If you see something that needs to be supported, blockchain, not blockchain, Web3, any of these things, IPFS, not IPFS, drop me an email. And like, I want to meet these people. So yeah, I actually told someone to take semantic web off a chart of things recently because I was like, I have too much trauma. Like, I have too much trauma about the semantic web. Like, no, it brings up bad memories. Okay, thanks everyone. Speak to you soon. And have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Bart.